The morning after the storm, I walked through Grandpa's cornfield with heavy boots crushing the wet earth beneath me. The wind had been fierce the night before, the kind that rattles windows and makes you grateful for solid walls. Now, in the aftermath, I could see its handiwork scattered across the 40 acres that had been in our family for 3 generations. Broken cornstalks lay twisted and bent, their golden ears scattered like abandoned treasures. The old weather vane on the barn had been twisted into an impossible angle, pointing neither north nor south but somewhere in between, as if confused by the violence it had witnessed. But it was the scarecrow that caught my attention first. Old Samuel, as Grandpa had called him, had stood guard over this field for as long as I could remember. His tattered flannel shirt and straw hat had become as much a part of the landscape as the ancient oak tree that marked the property line. Now Samuel lay fallen, his wooden crossframe snapped clean in half, his stuffing spread across the muddy ground like the remnants of some strange sacrifice. The sight should have made me smile. Grandpa always said Samuel was more decoration than deterrent anyway, but something about the scene felt different, wrong somehow. I approached the fallen guardian slowly, my eyes scanning the destruction. That's when I noticed it. The earth where Samuel had stood for decades was disturbed in a way that seemed unnatural. The storm had been powerful, yes, but this looked like something had been deliberately buried and then exposed. Something metallic glinted in the morning sun, partially hidden beneath the scattered straw and mud. My heart began to race as I knelt down, brushing away the debris with trembling fingers. Whatever Grandpa had hidden here had waited patiently for years, and now the wind had decided it was time for secrets to surface. The metal object was heavier than I expected. As I pulled it free from the earth, clods of dark soil fell away to reveal a small strongbox, the kind you might find in an old general store or a frontier bank. The metal was tarnished but intact, with an old-fashioned lock that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. I sat back on my heels, the box cradled in my lap like some precious artifact. The morning sun was climbing higher now, burning off the mist that had settled over the fields after the storm. Around me, the corn rustled with a sound like whispered secrets, as if the very plants knew what I had uncovered. My mind raced with possibilities. Grandpa had been a private man, the kind who kept his thoughts to himself and his past locked away like old photographs in an attic trunk. He died 3 months ago, leaving me this farm and 1,000 unanswered questions about the man who had raised me after my parents' car accident when I was 12. I turned the box over in my hands, feeling its weight, studying the craftsmanship. It was well made, built to last, built to protect whatever was inside from time and weather and prying eyes. The lock was solid, but I could see scratches around the keyhole, evidence that it had been opened regularly over the years. Standing up, I brushed the dirt from my jeans and looked back toward the farmhouse. The windows seemed to watch me like knowing eyes, keeping their own counsel about the secrets they'd witnessed over the decades. Smoke rose from the chimney where I'd built a fire before coming out to survey the storm damage. I needed to get inside, needed to find the key that would unlock this mystery. But as I walked back across the field, the box tucked under my arm like contraband, I couldn't shake the feeling that some secrets were buried for good reason. The farmhouse kitchen still smelled like the coffee I'd brewed at dawn, mixed with the lingering scent of rain and earth that clung to my clothes. I set the strongbox on the old pine table where Grandpa and I had shared countless meals, its presence somehow transforming the familiar space into something mysterious and charged with possibility. For an hour, I searched through every drawer, every cabinet, every hiding place I could think of. Grandpa had been methodical about most things, his tools organized, his paperwork filed, his life arranged with the precision of a man who understood that chaos was always just one step away. But if there was a key to this box, he'd hidden it better than the box itself. I was about to give up when I remembered the old roll-top desk in his bedroom. It had been his father's desk, brought west in a covered wagon according to family legend, and Grandpa had treated it with the reverence reserved for sacred objects. I'd rarely seen him use it, but sometimes late at night I'd hear the sound of drawers opening and closing, papers rustling like autumn leaves. The desk sat in the corner of his bedroom, its surface polished smooth by generations of hands. The roll-top was stuck, warped by years of prairie humidity, but with some gentle persuasion, it finally gave way with a sound like a sigh. Inside, I found the usual collection of old letters, faded receipts, and family photographs. But tucked away in a small compartment at the back was a tiny brass key, hung on a piece of worn leather cord. My hands shook as I lifted it free. The key felt warm in my palm, as if it had absorbed some of the heat from its hiding place. I held it up to the morning light streaming through the bedroom window, studying its simple design. This small piece of metal was about to unlock more than just a box. It was about to unlock whatever truth Grandpa had carried with him to his grave. Back in the kitchen, I sat staring at the strong box for what felt like hours. The key lay beside it on the table, innocent and small, but somehow heavy with the weight of possibility. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the windows and making the old house creak and settle like a living thing. I thought about Grandpa's hands, as I'd last seen them, folded peacefully across his chest in the funeral home. Those hands had built fences, harvested corn, fixed countless broken things over the years. They had also, apparently, buried secrets beneath his scarecrow and hidden keys in ancient desks. The lock turned easily, as if it had been waiting patiently for this moment. The lid lifted with barely a whisper of sound, revealing contents that made my breath catch in my throat. Inside, wrapped in an old piece of blue cloth, were photographs. Dozens of them, some yellowed with age, others newer, but still decades old. The first photograph I lifted showed a young woman with dark hair and laughing eyes, sitting on the front porch of a house I didn't recognize. She was beautiful in the way that transcended time, with a smile that seemed to light up the faded paper. On the back, in Grandpa's careful handwriting, were the words, "Elena, summer, 1962. I'd never heard him mention anyone named Elena. In all the years I'd lived with him, he'd never spoken of women from his past, never mentioned old friends or lost loves. His life had seemed to begin and end with this farm, with me, with the quiet routine of seasons and crops and the endless cycle of planting and harvest. But here was evidence of another life, another story that had run parallel to the one I thought I knew. My hands trembled as I lifted the next photograph, then the next, each one revealing another piece of a puzzle I hadn't even known existed. The photographs told a story of love and happiness that seemed to belong to a different man than the grandfather I'd known. Here was Grandpa as a young man, his face unlined and full of hope, his arm around Elena as they stood beside a lake I couldn't identify. Here they were dancing at what looked like a county fair, her dress spinning around her legs as he twirled her beneath strings of lights. There were pictures of picnics and gatherings, of Eleanor laughing with other young women, of Grandpa playing guitar while she sang. In every image, they looked at each other with the kind of love that makes observers feel both envious and hopeful about the possibilities of human connection. But as I worked my way through the stack, the photographs began to change. Elena's face grew thinner, her eyes larger and somehow sadder. In the later pictures, she was often bundled in blankets despite what appeared to be warm weather, and Grandpa's smile became forced, his eyes shadowed with worry. The last photograph nearly broke my heart. It showed Elena in what was clearly a hospital bed, her hair gone, her face gaunt but still beautiful. Grandpa sat beside her, holding her hand, both of them trying to smile for the camera. On the back, he had written simply, "Eleanor, October 1964, last day." I set the photograph down with hands that shook. Suddenly, so many things about Grandpa made sense. His solitude, his reluctance to talk about the past, the sadness that sometimes settled over him like fog. He had loved and lost someone precious, and he had carried that loss alone for nearly 60 years. But there was more in the box. Beneath the photographs lay a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, and beneath that, something that made me gasp aloud. It was a birth certificate dated March 15, 1965, for a baby girl named Sarah Elena Morrison. Listed as the father was my grandfather's name. The world seemed to shift beneath me as I stared at the birth certificate. A daughter. Grandpa had a daughter I'd never known about, never heard mentioned, never suspected existed. The paper was official, stamped and signed by a doctor in a town 2 counties over, dated 5 months after Elena's death. My mind raced with questions and calculations. If Elena had died in October 1964, but the baby was born in March 1965, then she must have been pregnant when she died. Or maybe she hadn't died at all, not then anyway. Maybe the last day notation referred to something else entirely, the last day of treatment, the last day in that particular hospital. With trembling fingers, I untied the ribbon around the letters. The paper was delicate, threatening to crumble at my touch, but I managed to unfold the first one carefully. It was dated November 1964, just a month after that heartbreaking photograph, and it was written in a woman's graceful handwriting. "My dearest Thomas," it began, and I had to stop reading for a moment to steady myself. No one had called Grandpa Thomas in all the years I'd known him. To everyone in town, to me, he had always been just Tom, solid and dependable Tom Morrison. But here was evidence of someone who had known him intimately enough to use his full name, to write to him with obvious love and longing. The letter continued. "The doctors say the baby is healthy and strong, despite everything we've been through. I can feel her moving inside me, and I like to think she's going to be a fighter like her father. I know we talked about names, and I still think Sarah would be perfect. Sarah Elena, after both our mothers." I had to set the letter down and walk to the window, looking out at the field where the broken scarecrow still lay scattered. Everything I thought I knew about my grandfather was proving to be incomplete, a surface story that hid depths I was only beginning to fathom. The letters painted a picture of a love story interrupted by tragedy, but not ended by it. Elena had survived her initial illness, cancer from the context of the letters, but her recovery was fragile, complicated by her pregnancy. She had been moved to a facility that specialized in treating expectant mothers with serious medical conditions, a place where she could receive the care both she and the baby needed. Grandpa had wanted to marry her immediately, but she had insisted they wait until after the baby was born, until they knew she would survive to be a proper wife and mother. Her letters were full of hope and determination, but also a heartbreaking realism about her chances. "I need you to promise me something, Thomas," one letter read. "If something happens to me, if I don't make it through this, you'll take care of our Sarah. Not just financially, but really take care of her, love her enough for both of us, give her the life we dreamed about together." The next few letters detailed her gradual weakening as the pregnancy progressed. The treatments that might have saved her life had to be postponed because of potential harm to the baby. She was sacrificing her own chances of survival for their daughter's life, and she seemed to be doing it without regret or bitterness. Her final letter was dated February 1965, just 3 weeks before Sarah's birth. Her handwriting was shaky, barely legible, but the love in her words was clear. "Our daughter will be here soon, and I may not be here to see her grow up. But she'll have you, and you're the best man I've ever known. Tell her about me someday. Tell her she was loved before she was even born." At the bottom of the box, I found Eleanor's death certificate. She had died 3 days after giving birth to Sarah. from complications related to her cancer. She had lived just long enough to hold her daughter, just long enough to make sure the baby was healthy and safe. The implications of what I'd discovered began to settle over me like a heavy blanket. Somewhere out there, I had an aunt I'd never known about. Sarah Eleanor Morrison would be nearly 60 years old now, possibly with children and grandchildren of her own. She was family, blood family, and Grandpa had never told me about her existence. But why the secrecy? Why bury these memories and documents beneath a scarecrow instead of celebrating the daughter he'd clearly loved? The answer came to me as I continued reading through papers at the bottom of the box. Adoption records, signed and dated just 6 weeks after Sarah's birth. Grandpa had given her up. Despite Elena's dying wish that he raise their daughter himself, he had placed her with a family named Patterson in the next state over. The adoption papers were formal and final, terminating all parental rights and sealing the records according to the laws of the time. A handwritten note tucked between the official documents explained his reasoning. I am a single man with no experience raising children, especially a baby girl. Sarah deserves better than what I can give her. The Pattersons are good people. He's a doctor, she's a teacher. They've been trying to have children for years. They can provide for Sarah in ways I never could. This is the hardest decision of my life, but I believe it's the right one for her. But that wasn't the end of the story. Hidden beneath the adoption papers were report cards, school photographs, and what appeared to be private investigators' reports spanning decades. Grandpa had been keeping track of his daughter from a distance, making sure she was happy and healthy and loved. The reports showed a girl who excelled in school, played violin in the orchestra, graduated valedictorian of her high school class. There were photographs of her wedding day, professional headshots from her career as a pediatric nurse, and eventually pictures of her own children, Grandpa's grandchildren he'd never met. The most recent report in the box was dated just 2 years ago, and it contained information that made my heart race. Sarah Patterson, now Sarah Patterson Williams after her marriage, was listed as living just 3 hours away in the city where I'd gone to college. She worked at the children's hospital there, had 2 grown sons, and was apparently still unaware of her biological father's identity. According to the investigators' notes, Sarah had tried to trace her birth parents several times over the years, but the sealed adoption records had blocked her efforts. She knew she was adopted. The Pattersons had been honest with her about that from an early age, but she'd never been able to find any information about her biological family. I stared at her most recent photograph for a long time, looking for traces of Grandpa in her face. She had Elena's dark hair, now streaked with silver, but her eyes were Grandpa's eyes, that particular shade of blue-gray that had always reminded me of storm clouds. She was beautiful in middle age, with laugh lines that spoke of happiness and a life well lived. The weight of what I'd discovered was almost overwhelming. Here was a woman who had spent decades wondering about her origins, never knowing that her biological father had been watching over her from afar, making sure she was safe and loved. And here was I, her biological nephew, with the power to answer questions she'd been asking her whole life. But was that what Grandpa would have wanted? He'd had 60 years to make contact with his daughter, 60 years to reveal himself and become part of her life. Instead, he'd chosen to love her from a distance, to remain a secret buried beneath a scarecrow in a cornfield. As I sat in his kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of his hidden life, I tried to understand his choices. Maybe he'd convinced himself that revealing the truth would disrupt her happiness, that she was better off with the family who had raised her. Or maybe he'd been afraid that she wouldn't want to know him, afraid that he'd disappoint her the way he felt he'd disappointed Eleanor. I spent the next 3 days in a haze of confusion and indecision. The storm damage to the farm needed attention, but I found myself unable to concentrate on anything beyond the contents of that strong box. I read and reread Eleanor's letters, studied every photograph, memorized the details of Sarah's life that Grandpa had so carefully documented. The more I learned about my hidden aunt, the more I realized how much Grandpa had missed. Her wedding day, the birth of her children, graduations and celebrations, and all the small moments that make up a life. He had chosen to remain on the outside, looking in through the lens of hired investigators and distant photographs. But he had loved her. That much was clear from every document, every report, every carefully preserved piece of evidence. He had loved her enough to let her go, and then loved her enough to spend the rest of his life making sure she was okay. On the fourth morning, I made a decision. I called the private investigation firm whose reports filled the box, hoping they were still in business. To my surprise, the same investigator who had been tracking Sarah for decades was still working, though he was nearing retirement himself. "Tom Morrison," he said when I identified myself. "I was sorry to hear about your grandfather's passing. He was a good man, one of my most faithful clients." "I found the box," I told him simply. There was a long pause. "I figured you might, eventually. Tom always said that if something happened to him, he hoped you'd be the one to find it." "What are you planning to do?" It was a good question, one I'd been wrestling with for days. "I don't know yet. What would you do if you were me?" "That's not my call to make," he said carefully, "but I will tell you this. In all my years of watching Sarah Patterson Williams, I've never seen anyone who seemed more ready to learn the truth about her past. She's asked questions every few years, tried to find information, even hired a couple of other investigators over the years. She wants to know where she came from." The investigator's words haunted me for another week. Every morning, I walked out to the field where Samuel the Scarecrow had once stood, looking down at the disturbed earth that had yielded up its secrets. The corn was growing back, green shoots pushing through the storm damage, but the spot where the Scarecrow had stood remained barren, marked only by the broken wooden cross that had been his frame. I had rebuilt the Scarecrow using new materials, but I'd moved him to a different location. It seemed wrong somehow to plant him back over the place where Grandpa's secrets had been buried. That spot belonged to the memory of Eleanor and the daughter he'd loved from afar. Finally, on a rainy Thursday morning, I made another decision. I drove to the city, following the address from the investigator's most recent report. Sarah's house was in a quiet neighborhood of tree-lined streets and well-maintained gardens, the kind of place where children rode bicycles and neighbors knew each other's names. I sat in my truck across the street for nearly an hour, watching the house, trying to summon the courage to walk up to the front door. What would I say? How do you tell someone that their biological father spent 60 years watching over them in secret? How do you explain a love so profound that it chose distance over disruption, silence over selfishness? At exactly 2:30, a woman emerged from the house, and I knew immediately it was Sarah. She moved with Grandpa's careful, measured pace, but there was Elena's grace in the way she carried herself. She was heading to her car, probably leaving for her shift at the hospital. I started my truck and followed at a distance, not because I was stalking her, but because I wasn't ready to confront her yet. I needed to see more of who she was, needed to understand the life Grandpa had chosen to observe from the shadows. At the hospital, I watched her interact with colleagues and patients. Even from a distance, I could see the warmth in her demeanor, the way people responded to her presence. She was clearly beloved by those she worked with, respected and trusted. The Pattersons had done well by her. She had become exactly the kind of person Grandpa had hoped she would become. That evening, I sat in my hotel room with my laptop, composing and deleting dozens of emails. How do you reach out to someone who doesn't know you exist? How do you begin a conversation that should have started 60 years ago? In the end, I decided on simplicity and honesty. I wrote a brief message explaining who I was, mentioning that I had recently inherited my grandfather's farm, and saying that I had discovered some documents that suggested we might be related. I asked if she would be willing to meet for coffee to discuss what I'd found. I read the email at least 20 times before finally pressing send. Then I lay awake most of the night, staring at the ceiling and wondering what I had set in motion. Her reply came the next morning while I was having breakfast in the hotel restaurant. My phone chimed, and there was her name in my inbox, Sarah Patterson Williams. My hands shook as I opened the message. "Dear Tom," it read, "your email has left me almost speechless. I've been searching for information about my biological family for most of my adult life, and I never imagined that someone would reach out to me instead. Yes, I would very much like to meet with you and see what you've discovered. When would be convenient?" We arranged to meet that afternoon at a small cafe downtown. I spent the morning driving around the city, trying to calm my nerves and organize my thoughts. I had brought copies of some of the photographs and documents, enough to prove our connection without overwhelming her with the full story all at once. The cafe was crowded with the lunch crowd when I arrived, but I spotted her immediately at a corner table. She had chosen a spot that offered some privacy, and I could see the tension in her shoulders, the careful way she watched the door. This meeting was as nerve-wracking for her as it was for me. "Sarah?" I approached the table cautiously, and she looked up with those familiar blue-gray eyes. "You must be Tom." She stood to shake my hand, and I was struck again by how much she resembled Grandpa. "I have to admit, I haven't been able to think about anything else since your email." We ordered coffee and sat in awkward silence for a moment. Two strangers who were bound by blood but separated by decades of secrecy. Finally, Sarah spoke. "I've been adopted since I was 6 weeks old," she said quietly. "My parents, the Pattersons, were wonderful people, and I had a happy childhood. But I've always wondered about where I came from, who I looked like, whether I had any biological family still living." I pulled out the envelope of documents I'd brought, setting it on the table between us like an offering. "I think I can answer some of those questions," I said. "But first, you should know that this story isn't entirely happy. There's love in it, but there's also loss and difficult choices." Her eyes were fixed on the envelope. "I've imagined every possible scenario over the years," she said. "I'm ready for whatever you have to tell me." I started with Elena, showing her the photographs of her mother, explaining about the love story that had been cut short by cancer and difficult choices. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she studied the pictures, tracing her mother's face with gentle fingers. "She's beautiful," she whispered. "I can see something of myself in her features." And then I showed her the photograph of her father, my grandfather, and watched her face change as she absorbed the resemblance between them. "Thomas Morrison," I said. "My grandfather, which makes you my aunt. He loved your mother deeply, and he loved you enough to make what he thought was the best decision for your future." The story poured out of me then. Elena's illness, the difficult pregnancy, the choice to place Sarah with a family who could give her everything Grandpa thought he couldn't. I explained about the decades of watching from afar, the reports and photographs, and careful documentation of her life. "He never stopped loving you," I concluded, "but he thought you were better off not knowing about him." Sarah was quiet for a long time, processing everything I'd told her. Finally, she looked up at me with eyes that were bright with unshed tears, but also with something that looked like relief. "All my life, I've wondered if I was wanted," she said. "If my biological parents loved me, or if I was just a mistake they needed to hide. Now I know that I was wanted, that I was loved, even if that love had to express itself in ways I never knew about." We talked for 3 more hours, sharing stories and filling in the gaps that decades of separation had created. Sarah told me about her life, her medical career, her husband, her 2 sons who were now in their 20s and starting families of their own. She showed me pictures of her family, and I realized that Grandpa had great-grandchildren he'd never known about. "I wish I could have met him," she said finally. "I wish I could have thanked him for loving me enough to give me a good life, even though it meant sacrificing his own chance to be part of it. He would have liked that," I told her. "But I think, in his own way, he knew you were grateful. The investigator said you turned out exactly like he hoped you would, kind, successful, surrounded by people who love you. That was all he ever wanted." We made plans to meet again the following week. Sarah wanted to see the farm, to stand in the field where her existence had been kept secret for so many years. She wanted to visit Grandpa's grave, to have the conversation with him that they'd never been able to have in life. As we prepared to leave the cafe, she reached across the table and took my hand. "Thank you," she said, "for finding the truth and for having the courage to share it with me. I know this couldn't have been easy for you either." Driving back to the farm that evening, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. The secrets that had been buried beneath the scarecrow were finally free, and a family that had been broken by circumstance was beginning to heal. The next week, Sarah came to visit the farm with her husband and sons. We walked through the cornfield together, and I showed her the exact spot where Samuel had stood guard over her father's secrets for all those years. She knelt and placed her hands on the earth, saying a quiet prayer for the parents who had loved her in different ways. Later, at Grandpa's grave, she left flowers and spoke to him in words I couldn't hear, but didn't need to. Some conversations are meant to be private, even when they come 60 years too late. As the sun set over the cornfield that evening, I rebuilt Samuel the Scarecrow one more time, but this time Sarah helped me. We positioned him in his new location, looking out over the growing corn, and I told her the stories Grandpa used to tell me about their faithful guardian. "He's not just protecting the crops anymore," Sarah said, smiling as she adjusted Samuel's hat. "He's protecting all our family stories, the ones we know and the ones we're still discovering." The wind that had knocked down Grandpa's scarecrow and revealed his hidden truth continued to blow across the prairie, but now it carried with it the sound of healing, of secrets finally shared, and of a love that had never truly been buried, only planted deep and left to grow. Thank you so much for listening to this story of family, secrets, and the unexpected ways love can endure across decades. Stories like this remind us that our families often hold mysteries we never suspect, and that sometimes the most profound love is the kind that sacrifices itself for someone else's happiness. I'd love to hear from all of you who listen to this tale. Please write in the comments and tell me what part of the world you're listening from. Are you in a small farming community like the one in our story? Or are you in a big city? Are you someone who has searched for biological family? Or perhaps someone who has secrets of your own that are waiting to be discovered? And if you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more tales that explore the complex, beautiful, and sometimes surprising nature of family, love, and the secrets we keep. Your support means the world to me, and it allows me to continue sharing these stories with listeners around the globe. Until next time, remember that every family has stories waiting to be told, and sometimes the most powerful truths are the ones that have been buried the deepest.